Hello, everyone. Shalom. Welcome to the breakout session, Why the US-Israel Alliance Holds and How It's Being Redefined. Well, they're going to answer it for you. I'm Sally Porish. I'm the Chief People Officer here at the Ashwin Family JCC and a proud supporter of Z3. So we're glad you're all here. Thank you. Before we begin, a couple of reminders. To remind all of us of what makes these conversations distinctly Z3. Our work is grounded in 3 core principles. Number 1, unity, not uniformity. We aim to honor our differences while working for the oneness of the Jewish people. Number 2, engaging as equal partners. We bring together Israelis and diaspora Jews to build our common future. Number 3, diversity of voices. We convene Zionists of differing backgrounds and perspectives across political and religious lines. You may hear ideas today and throughout the day that challenge your own, and that's by design. These sessions aren't about agreement, but about encounter, listening deeply, engaging respectfully, and widening our shared understanding. So please, we have a lot of listening to do. Again, if you have questions, you'll find index cards and pens in the back, and towards the end, I'll be collecting them and giving them to our moderator, who I am pleased to introduce my colleague and moderator, Emma Cruz Berger, who will introduce our honored guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. Can everyone hear me? Thanks so much. Alan here. I'm Emma Goss. I am a reporter at the Jewish News of Northern California. I encourage you, if you haven't already seen our table in the Midrahov, get involved, sign up for our newsletter, say hi to us. I also am a freelance reporter on NBC Bay Area, and I am thrilled to share this stage and engage in a great conversation with 2 esteemed experts on the Middle East, on Israel-US relations, and on American politics as well. To my furthest end, we have Nadav Eyal, who is a political journalist and author, columnist for Yediot Ahronot and Ynet, and senior commentator for Channel 12 in Israel, and a regular commentator on a very popular podcast that many of us listen to, Call Me Back. Big fans. Breaking down the news affecting the Jewish world in Israel today. And many of us already heard some great sharp insights earlier in the morning plenary from Ambassador Dan Shapiro. I'm going to read a little longer bio than what you got this morning, because you've done some impressive work as an American diplomat, serving, as we know, as the ambassador to Israel under the Obama administration and in numerous senior foreign policy positions. Ambassador Shapiro is currently a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council, providing policymakers with fresh insights into core U.S. national security interests relevant to opportunities and challenges in the Middle East. Thank you both so much for being here on this stage. Let's dive right in. This is a panel talking about the importance of the relationship and the challenges that Israel and the U.S. face as strategic key allies. It has been a relationship that has been constantly tested, maybe more so in the last 2 years than we're used to seeing. But beneath the surface of shared values and strategic ties lies shifting politics, generational divides, and new global realities reshaping the priorities of both nations. And I wanted to start out with the latter part, the generational divides and the new global challenges. And I wanted to go into what you talked about just a little earlier, which was the mayoral election in New York City. Dan, you flew in from New York. Last week, Zohran Mamdani was elected mayor of New York City, and we can talk about his age, his politics, his beliefs around Israel and Palestine, but I'm curious, zooming out of New York and just that one election, is there more to extrapolate more broadly on what his win tells us about the left and the right, and about younger demographics in the US, how their enthusiasm for him, and what it says about the relationship with Israel, which he's very critical of.
Sure. Thanks for having me at Z3. Good to be with you, Emma, and you, Nadav. It's a very timely and important subject, and I think it's worth some time, but I also think it has consumed maybe more attention of our collective communal attention than maybe it is warranted. I'll just say briefly why I think that's the case. Of course, the mayor of New York has minimal, if any, no real foreign policy responsibilities. So whatever views he comes into this job with, he won't conduct the foreign policy of the United States. He will have some modest ability to affect the city of New York's relationship with the state of Israel. And there are people in his coalition from the Democratic Socialists of America calling for him to institute a whole range of BDS initiatives to cut off cooperation with Israeli institutions, buying Israeli products or investing in Israeli bonds or these kinds of things, or the Cornell Tech partnership with the Technion, which is on Roosevelt Island. So he's under pressure or being urged to follow through in those areas, which would be bad. And hopefully he will decide that is not really where he wants to put the focus of his administration, that he will put the focus on the other thing he really campaigned on, actually the main thing he campaigned on, which was the affordability of the city. He's got a bunch of ideas. I'm not sure his ideas are so great on that either, but that was actually the thing that really, I think, was the major driver of his campaign, and his successful communication skills and his terrible competition. And there are a lot of reasons why he won, and also a lot of reasons why a mayor that wins 50% in a very heavy Democratic city, Democratic nominee who wins 50%, should tell us that that maybe doesn't extrapolate out to the broader party or the broader country. Certainly won't have much to do with how successful candidates will run in the swing states and the swing districts. On the same night he won, we saw Mikey Sherrill, very moderate member of Congress, win, and the governor of New Jersey. Same with Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. So I don't think we should over-extrapolate. But let's be clear. He probably did tap into a vein of discontent and disagreement about the U.S. partnership with Israel among some aspects of his constituency, maybe defined by their own religious or ethnic affiliations, but also among youth. And I think the statistics, as we've seen, is that he won something like 33% of Jewish voters in New York. I'm sure it skews heavily towards younger voters. And that is a challenge to us, to those of us who believe, those of us in my party, and those of us in our community, and those of us in the country who believe that there's some really core, fundamental moral and strategic interests in the U.S.-Israel partnership. And with everything that's happened over the last 2 years, first seeing Israel attacked in the worst attack since the Holocaust on the Jewish people, and then attacked multiple times subsequent to that by many other enemies around the region with real intent for destruction, not just for harm. And the way the United States came to Israel's defense, and the way the United States even helped build a coalition in the region to Israel's defense, which points the way toward a better future, and a better future that could even influence in a positive way what seems like a completely dead-end future for Israelis and Palestinians, has seemed like that, and certainly seems like that after October 7th, to find a better political horizon for them. It's important for us to do that education with our youth population, who I think one can understand. Look at the situation in Gaza and feel that the people in Gaza are suffering. They are suffering. They've suffered terribly. I would argue they've suffered, and I said this in the other session, primarily because of Hamas's misrule and Hamas's ideological crusade and willingness to conduct terrorism against Israel and from civilian populations in Gaza, and then use the casualties that occur among civilians in Gaza as part of their propaganda war. So there's a lot of education to do about that. But we also shouldn't pretend or try to dismiss that real suffering has occurred, and even mistakes have been made by Israel or by the United States or by others that have contributed to that. So there's something to listen to from that stream of our youthful population, but there's also something to educate them about.
In terms of young Democrats, liberals, progressives, right, Mamdani and the idea of a democratic socialist of America, are we seeing a situation where younger voters that are liberal are going to a point so far left that it's an extreme view against Israel?
Well, my assessment isn't important in that sense. What's important is what studies and polls are telling us, and also, whether these are more liberal or progressive pollsters or more conservative ones. The trend is very clear between the ages of 18 to 24, and probably even older than that. The trend is against Israel, even if you counter Israel with Hamas. So if you look, for instance, at the Harvard-Harris poll, who do you support? And Hamas is a fundamentalist, Islamist, violent movement that ruled Gaza through a theocracy. And Israel has positioned itself, and I think that's also true, as having some shared values with this republic. And you see that many young people, many young people, dozens of percentiles, say that they would support Hamas. Now, do they understand what Hamas is? Are they knowledgeable about the facts? No, usually they aren't, but that doesn't matter for political power. And as we have seen with Mamdani, what matters is that you get the right to vote anyway. And with Mamdani, I'm slightly more worried than Danny is about him. For instance, his promise to close down the unit within the NYPD, the Strategic Response Group, that actually deals, for instance, with violations or allegations to violations as to anti-Semitic violence, sometimes in campuses. So I don't know if he's actually going to go through with this. We'll see what the NYPD commissioner has to say, and he has promised that she's going to stay if she wants to stay in her job. But this is just one example. I also think that we should be very worried as to usage of slogans and cliches as to where we are at right now. I think that the world of shared values as something that dictates political power and policy meaning has eroded substantially in today's world, and this has nothing to do with Israel. It has a lot to do with the way that politics has changed in our age. And it's changed in a way in which everything is much more extreme, and the very idea of values or of a core value system of a society in general, specifically the American society, but also the Israeli society, has very much eroded towards the extremes. And this is why we're seeing both Mamdani and Tucker Carlson, and we're seeing the Heritage Foundation president backing the idea that Nick Fuentes' opinions should be at least heard or debated. This is not something that we would have seen 20 or 30 years ago. And the reason that we wouldn't have seen this 20 or 30 years ago is twofold. One is that the entire political sphere has lost its general balance, and the center has lost its balance altogether. Politicians today in many spaces are not aspiring to get that space. Although I should say that we shouldn't throw this out of the window. If you look at Pennsylvania, if you look at the people who have just won these elections, you're not going to win the next presidency by only aligning yourself with your base. Mm-hmm. And that's true for any candidate right now who wants to run in 2028. But the second reason, and I think we should face it, is that 20 or 30 years ago, many of these politicians might have been deterred as a result of the unity of Jewish communities. And
what do you mean they were deterred by the unity of Jewish communities?
They would see that the Jewish community as a political force in this country was in a different position than it is today. If you're now a politician and you want to run, in certain areas, again, you might drive political power by attacking Jews who identify as Zionists. And the problem with Mamdani is, I hope everybody understands that we're going to see a copycat phenomena across this country. We just don't know the extent of that copycat phenomena. Why is that? Because you can actually acquire political power and support by attacking the Jews. And this is something that is not a first in history, even not a first in the history of this great nation. But this is definitely something that has changed to the worse in the last 20 years, and we should face that. This has a lot to do with our politics everywhere, including in Israel, becoming more extreme. But this is a problem we should be really facing, and it worries me as an Israeli, not as a person who right now resides in this country to teach.
You mentioned that we're off balance, that the extremes are so far apart, and it wasn't that long ago that Israel was a bipartisan issue, that you could be someone on the left or someone on the right and agree on support for Israel, support for its defense. Not to speculate, but what could occur to allow for a toned down rhetoric, or Dan, you were saying you can have a Venn diagram with Jason Greenblatt and have 90% agreements, even when you disagree on other things. When it comes to Israel, it feels like that's the one thing people cannot come to terms on in agreement with.
Yeah. I would say I think things will make a difference. It's not going to solve everything that Nadav just accurately described, and it's not going to eliminate the extremes on either side. But obviously, this period of these 2 years of war and the suffering that comes with war, and the way people have gone to their battle stations, let's say, and their political battle stations, when that is not the dominant picture on the screen, when that is not the dominant narrative, it will at least take some of the heat, some of the emotion out of it. And I think it will be easier to define, where those kind of limits are. Again, as I mentioned during the earlier session, somebody who either holds the view or concludes because of the things that happened in the war that Israel is a legitimate racist apartheid state that should not exist at all and the United States should have no relationship with it, that's on the fringe.
It also lacks nuance.
And it lacks nuance. I think there is a not insignificant portion, even in our own community, of people who don't think that, and yet have been very unhappy and very distressed by what they have seen happening to civilians in Gaza, as anybody with a human soul should, and have drawn some, I would say, extreme and inaccurate conclusions, but that doesn't necessarily push them, or they won't remain in that full camp. We have work to do to help hold them. So that's one thing that will at least change the dynamic around which this conversation takes place. Another thing that will affect it, and this is just to be as honest as I can with an audience, is who is the leadership of the State of Israel? The current prime minister, we all know, democratically elected in the Israeli system, so legitimate. A lot of questions about how he's chosen to conduct himself internally in Israel, and a kind of divisive politics that even preceded October 7th. And I was in Israel in August and September before the big breakthrough on the hostages, and heard, from a particular segment of Israeli society, but I heard a lot of bitterness and a lot of anger about how the war was conducted, how the hostages were prioritized, and so forth. But there's also just no question, and again, I'm thinking about the Democratic side of this equation, that there's a lot of baggage and a lot of history, and it would be different if there were a different prime minister of Israel. I was asked in 2020 or 21 by the Washington Post, when Israel was going through its repeat elections, I forget which one it was, when it looked like Netanyahu might not be elected. They said, what will be the effect on the U.S.-Israel relationship if there's a different prime minister of Israel? And thinking about it, I said, the real difference is that 95% of Americans won't know the name of the Israeli prime minister. And that will be great. That will be great, right? That person coming to Washington will be like the Prime Minister of Portugal. They will come and do foreign policy and some business and some agreements and disagreements and some handshakes, and then they will go home, and that will be the end of it. It doesn't have to be a huge centering event in our politics and even in the emotions of our political debate. And again, Israelis will make their choice, and they will make it on their basis of their system. And so I have no say in that, no stake in that, essentially. But it will affect it if we are dealing with an Israeli prime minister that doesn't come with all of the history and the baggage of his long tenure, and then especially of these last 2 years.
Yeah, speaking of Netanyahu, in your voicing that he's done significant damage to Israel's worldwide reputation and the ability for Americans to ever come to terms with agreeing on Israel, you're saying it's largely to do with him being in power.
I want to say largely. It's a factor. What I'm saying is what will help change the dynamic of this discourse, that is a factor that will help change the dynamic of this discourse.
So, Dan, you were part of the Obama administration, and unfortunately, I think that Israel has made some serious mistakes. And I reported on some of these back when, for instance, Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to go and have that speech in Congress. And I remember the way that grassroots Democrats, and I'm not talking about Congress people in Washington, but the way that I then traveled before 2016, before the elections, to places like Coal Country in Pennsylvania, or black communities in Detroit, the way that they echoed that story about that speech in Congress against the JCPOA during the Obama administration. And we thought that might be a mistake vis-a-vis the administration. But what really happened was that sediment of, as one grassroots organizer told me in Detroit, I think, you disrespected our president. And that was the usage of the expression. I think that was meaningful. Look, this is not an equal relationship. This is not a relationship between partners or spouses. The United States is the world's most important military and economic power. Its power doesn't compete with anything today, but it doesn't compete with anything in history. What Israeli leaders always knew about the United States is that keeping this relationship since the 1960s, when the US understood how important Israel is, because Israel was winning wars. And that's very important, that Israel was powerful, that Israel was successful, that you could trust Israel. So the Israeli Prime Minister always understood that this alliance is Israel's number one, absolutely number one advantage in a globalized world. And that means not giving nice speeches or ill-advised speeches. That means not PR or putting lipstick on it. That means making decisions that are aligned with keeping and securing this kind of relationship with the United States, knowing that you are that small and the US is this big, and you really need to face that. And I think that Israeli leadership has basically forgotten about that. Maybe because they saw the type of support that Israel enjoyed in the United States for many years. They were banking on it. And by the way, even if you look at the way that Congress reacted to October 7 and the way that Congress reacted to President Biden's requests to assist Israel militarily during the war. So you definitely saw that. That was merely 2 years ago. And now we see that it's a different scenario. I think that if this request would have been brought today to Congress, we would have had probably a majority, absolutely an impressive majority, but I don't think we would have seen what we saw 2 years ago. And I think that this has a lot to do with the same hubris, and I'm saying this as an Israeli. It's my job also as a journalist to be critical of my government. I think that the same hubris that to an extent led us to October 7 has led us to make many, many mistakes in the relationship with the United States. And one of that mistakes was that for the Netanyahu consecutive governments, at a certain point, they decided that the Democratic Party is, it's gone. for them, or large chunks of the Democratic Party is gone. And unless you're a die-hard Democrat for Israel, like John Fetterman or Richie Torres, they don't employ a lot of resources in order to get you back. I think that's a major mistake. And another mistake was this assumption that what does Israel give back to the US? What's the messaging there as to what it gives back? What are the decisions that you make even during the war to not only give the impression but actually make this alliance a live thing? Not enough work has been done in that sense.
If I could just add one thought. Nadav mentioned the speech in 2015 and their long, I think, tale of emotional scars that have made it a challenge for people like me in my party. Although I worked for President Biden after that, who was, as you mentioned, strongly supportive, and I think there still are many who are strongly supportive, but that scar is there. On the table for 2026 is this question. Israel will be going to elections, and there may be that some will decide that there's value in the Prime Minister coming and giving a similar speech in the Congress next year. Now, I invite our audience to think about the question, is that a good thing? Is that a good thing for the relationship? Is that a good thing if your focus is on not the political interests of the individual leaders in each country, but rather on the durability of a bipartisan commitment that will long outlive the current leaders and recover from the difficulties of the last 2 years? Would that be a good decision? And just put the image in your mind of what that will look like. People will come to different conclusions about that, but some of the mistakes you referenced are not just behind us; they might also be ahead of us.
Nadav, you mentioned that it's not an equitable relationship at this moment in time between the U.S. and Israel.
It's never going to be. It's never going to be.
It's never going to be.
No, but just because of the sheer size of Israel and its importance. It's very important for me. I'm an Israeli, but yeah, sorry.
Well, going down that road, talking about the question that you raised, what does Israel give in value to the U.S.? I want to dig in on that, but also note that you mentioned that it was easy to have a strong allyship with Israel when Americans, by and large, felt like they could trust Israel. And a lot of trust has been eroded. I think social media and AI might also be factors in making it hard to trust what anyone is seeing online these days. But I wanted to drill into that idea of like the trust has been lost and where can the value be added?
So first of all, in terms of trust, there's a notion of trust between this administration and between Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. There are always disagreements there, but I don't want to overplay that. They have proved an amazingly effective relationship by now, and also the friction has been behind closed doors almost entirely. I think that Netanyahu, in that sense, understood very quickly that he can simply never, ever be confrontational with this president. And even when there are confrontations between Israel and the White House, it's kept behind closed door, or the president himself is airing them. Now, first of all, I think it's a great idea. We should have employed that 20 years ago. It's a great idea for any president if you're the prime minister of Israel. I remember one president who said, after one meeting in the White House with one prime minister, I didn't remember who's the prime minister of Israel and who's the president of the United States. And that wasn't President Obama that said that. So I think that in that regard, look at what has happened with this Trump administration. The Trump administration managed to push through an agreement that was actually construed by Bill Burns during the Biden administration. I think Bill Burns, who I, by the way, never spoke with, he's not a source of mine, doesn't get enough credit for the way that he manufactured that second agreement to get the hostages out. He employed thousands of hours into that, and it was the Trump administration and President Trump who decided and sent Steve Witkoff to Prime Minister Netanyahu and said, this agreement is going to come through, and it's going to be before the inauguration. And afterwards, the way that the president worked with the prime minister as to the war, and specifically as to the 12-day war in Iran. And the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu both managed to get a green light from this president to preemptively attack Iran. That's number one. And secondly, to convince Americans, or at least have that result, that the US attacked those installations that needed the American ability, that's a huge win personally for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the Netanyahu government. And it was that because they did work together, and they do have that trust. Now, if you look at the statements made by President Trump since the last agreement, just the public statements, his Time magazine interview, the way that he spoke with Sean Hannity over the phone right after this agreement was achieved, you see that there is, as always there is luggage there. So for him to say, for the president to say stuff like, I told Netanyahu that Israel can't fight against the entire world. He didn't say that once, he didn't say that twice. And to give that impression that the US was pushing Israel. One of the things that the American conservative movement is, I think, very sensitive about, and I would be sensitive about as an American too, is the idea that Israel is somehow manipulating the US towards decisions. Mm-hmm. Or I heard Israeli analysts saying every decision or every statement made in the White House was prepared in Jerusalem or in
that Trump's just a puppet? Is that?
So I heard, so if Israelis voicing that, and these Israelis are voicing sometimes what's heard in the Prime Minister's office. Everybody in this room who's American, and me, you know, the Israeli, we all understand how toxic this is. It's also not true. And this is exactly what we should be wary of. And this is exactly the sense of hubris that might ruin the trust that they do have. And they did have with the Abraham Accords. So I suggest we don't downplay how effective was the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump. By the way, it's very effective because Prime Minister Netanyahu is basically right now is trying to convince President Trump, but when the president makes a decision, that's it. And by the way, this is one of the reasons we have a ceasefire in Gaza, we have all the live hostages back home, and it seems that we're doing something that the Israelis always said be impossible, never happen. We're internationalizing the Gaza Strip. Something that numerous Israeli prime ministers said we will never agree to. And it turns out that Netanyahu is agreeing to. I'm not sure, I don't know if it's going to work, but I do know it's the decision of the president. It's being handled by Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, and it's been very effective, and it's been working very quickly. By the way, it's very mainstream. It's a very mainstream approach. You can clap to President Trump if you want to, even in Palo Alto. But
I think it flipped. People's heads were spinning when they saw the outcomes of the deal and the last remaining hostages come home and feel so thankful. And so many American Jews, especially here in California, did not vote for President Trump and are so removed from supporting him that it was hard to wrap our heads around the joy we were feeling and who accomplished it. Yeah. How did you two take in all of it?
So it won't surprise anybody that I'm among those who did not vote for President Trump. And I think there's grave damage being done to our country and our democracy by his policies, his running roughshod over constitutional principles, his enriching himself and his family. I won't go into all of those details. But I have not hesitated to give credit where due to him personally and to his team for first working with the outgoing Biden administration on that hostage deal during the transition. Then, and I think there were subsequent mistakes, by the way. The Gaza Riviera proposal, not a good idea. Yeah. Signing off on Israel going back, not continuing with phase 2 of the hostage deal and cutting off its interassistance. Not a good idea. Signing off, I thought, on the Gaza City operation later in the year, not a good idea. But I strongly supported the decision first to back Israeli strikes on Iran. This was necessary and inevitable, given how the Iranian nuclear program had advanced, and then even more so, of course, to participate and use the unique American capabilities to defeat those underground enrichment facilities. Very important, full credit. And of course, full credit. I said I was in Israel in September and heard a lot of unhappiness. By the time I got home and settled in, but just after Rosh Hashanah, this deal was working its way through, and it was miraculous to see all the live hostages come home alive, and now to see all but 4 of the deceased hostages also home. It's amazing that Hadar Golding's family can finally exhale after 11 years. And full credit. And also, as Nav suggests, to put on the table ideas which probably, had they been put on the table by a different president, would have engendered a very strong negative reaction, public reaction, and an attempt to put on counter pressures in the American political system, as we've seen in the past, and was done to Obama and was done to Biden, and also might have even scored some political points in Israel for a prime minister who would do that. The current situation, President Trump perceives accurately, is the prime minister cannot publicly disagree with him, and it will serve him very poorly in Israel if it does, and he can't generate the counter pressures because of the way the president's standing in his own party and because Democrats want this war to end are. So we have on the table a unique opportunity, and it may or may not work, to repeat Nadav's point, but at least to try to get out of this terrible war something more positive. And what does it include? It includes things like not just international forces coming into Gaza once Hamas is disarmed. By the way, that's the key that unlocks all of this, is Hamas's disarmament, which may or may not happen. But if you can get that done, then international forces, it means international reconstruction, it means some role for the Palestinian Authority, and guess what else? A discussion about a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. I mean, that is not something that I think the current coalition in Israel is particularly enthusiastic about, maybe thinks they can buy time and push it off. But the current president of the United States, who they won't publicly disagree with, says that's part of his 20-point plan. Now, it also is true that this plan that is on the table, and in fits and starts moving forward, is part of the recipe, and we'll see more when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia comes to Washington next week, of taking advantage of the end of this war, of the strong U.S.-Israel partnership, of the blows to the Iranian axis by Israeli military power and U.S. military power over the last 2 years, to get back on the road of the real opportunity we have here of building this coalition of integrated Israeli, moderate Arab, U.S. partners to build out not just security, but other forms of cooperation in energy and water and technology and business and all sorts of other ways. That is the real interest that the United States can advance here in this moment. And when I think about, to your kind of earlier question, when we need to help a different generation, or maybe a generation that's been forged by the war and everything they've seen happening, understand what is the value proposition of the U.S.-Israel partnership. It doesn't take long, if you really think about the region, understand the region, maybe people don't have all that background, to see what would happen to U.S. interests if we didn't have that partnership. If Israel wasn't able to defend itself, if Israel wasn't able to be the leading edge against those enemies and adversaries that threaten both it and our interests as well. If it wasn't building out that partnership with Arab states who see advantage to doing so because, in part, what it means for their relationship with the United States, we would very quickly see a decline in our own influence in the Middle East, blows to our interests. We'd see all sorts of atrophying of that potential and real coalition as countries would hedge. They'd cut their own deals with Iran. They'd cut their own deals with Russia and China, our adversaries and competitors coming into this region. The core of our ability to maintain that influence and maintain our own interests in the Middle East is this partnership, is this relationship, and Israel's ability to be strong and able to protect itself, and in doing so as it builds out that regional coalition. So we have an opportunity. I'm going to work very hard to educate people in my own party who raise the question, is it worth it? Are they manipulating us? Are they taking resources, and are they doing things we don't like? Yes, by the way, they're doing things we don't like in the West Bank, for example, things that are enabled by very extreme members of the current Israeli coalition who do damage to that whole regional project and damage to this relationship. But at core, is that relationship of value to us and to our interests? It's not even a close call. But that is something that has to be explained and then carried forward in policy.
Nadav, going back to the hostage release and President Trump's kind of heroism with that, how were Israelis taking it in, and what was your opinion of how it's all playing out?
So first of all, President Trump enjoys great poll numbers and trust with the Israeli public, which President Obama didn't at the time. And President Biden saw, I would say, better numbers than Obama. However, Trump across the region is very respected. And I think, if you look at the entire this presidency, or if you look at his first term, interestingly, it's in the Middle East that President Trump has seen his greatest accomplishments. The hostage deal right now, and the Abraham Accords, and as a foreign policy issue, the fact that this administration is being incentivized to deal with the Middle East is a first. Usually for American administrations, since unfortunately President Clinton failed at Camp David to reach an agreement that will end the conflict with the Palestinians, the Middle East is a headache. It's, of course, it holds the prospect of a grand White House lawn ceremony and the Nobel Peace Prize, but because consecutive US presidents have seen mostly disappointment there, had to deal with very stubborn Israeli prime ministers and very unreliable Palestinian partners. It's something that I don't want to say that they wanted to push aside, but if I look, for instance, at President Obama's push through Secretary Kerry at the time for negotiations, you could see that the president was distancing himself. Now, I would also point to another thing, which is the reason that President Trump is so respected across the region. And by across the region, I mean everywhere in the region. President Trump is not only the most popular president in Israel in many years, it's also the most popular president as far as the Saudis are concerned.
And Qatar?
And yeah, unfortunately for me as Israeli, and in Qatar. And with the UAE too. There's something about the vibe or the messaging of the president that simply works, I guess, in the Middle East. But it's not only that. It's not only about style. It's also about, and that's a great example, I think, right after the agreement was reached, there's a ceasefire and the hostages are being released. And Hamas has started to basically to infringe or to violate the agreement. So the classic maneuver of international diplomacy there in general, and specifically, unfortunately, US presidents before President Trump, would be to distance themselves from the violations of the agreement and allow lower level people in their government to deal with the violations which are now disrupting this perfect image of an agreement and the hostages going back home. And to the credit of this president, he immediately took up Truth Social again and again and again to condemn Hamas, to threaten Hamas, and he was hands-on as to this. I cannot even begin to explain how this is breaking the rules of getting any agreement in the Middle East. Usually, US involvement on these higher levels, specifically the president, will take the win, then allow other people, maybe your Secretary of State or your Undersecretary of State, to deal with the small violations. And the president decided that this is his project. Now, again, we wouldn't be speaking here. This agreement wouldn't have survived if he wouldn't have done that, almost immediately.
If he hadn't posted to Truth Social?
No, it's not only about his posting. It's about sending Jared and Steve Witkoff. It's about ordering the American army to open a position immediately, not in 3 months from now. Even if they don't know exactly what they're doing in Kiryat Gat, or they're working on it, it's work in progress, but Do it right now. This hands-on approach is the way you should conduct yourself in a Middle East conflict. By the way, this is the way that great American presidents that ended wars, that were there, this is how they conducted themselves. This is how Henry Kissinger was out there in 1973, 1974. This is how Richard Nixon did that. This is, to some extent, how the Clinton administration worked this out. You want to get results done. It's the president's involvement, phone call after phone call. Now, President Biden at the time, at the beginning of the war, did that when he said to Hezbollah, don't. So he was very much there, and consecutive phone calls as to bakeries opened in Gaza, right? But it's a completely different story right now because of the Israeli government, because of the dynamic of the conflict that has led us to maturation, something that doesn't get enough credit. Sometimes conflicts just mature to the point of ending. And because President Trump enjoys the type of trust and leverage in Israel that no other US president has enjoyed in many years.
I'm keeping track of time, and in about 10 minutes, we're going to collect those cards. So if you've been wanting to ask a question, you can turn it in to, I believe my colleague Sally is going to come around and collect your cards, and I'll be reading a few of them for our panel. Last year at Z3, I was listening to two panelists talk about how when the war is over someday, and they didn't know when, it would end, like a ceasefire would occur in Israel or in Gaza, but the war and how it had fractured Americans and the anti-Semitism that has surged here in the US, that would take years longer to clean up than just an ending to the war. And they were saying, like, the war would last a lot longer and the damage and ramifications for American Jews would be felt in a deeper and more longer lasting way. And I felt a very sad feeling listening to that, but I also understand the reality of that. And I wanted to pose the question to both of you, what role does Israel have in terms of dealing with the scourge of anti-Semitism globally that's played out because of the war? And now that it's over, we think, is it time to address it here?
It's such a softball, so Dan will begin.
Sorry. Can we address it here? Is
Well,
it
let me pick at the foundations of the question to buy myself some time here.
I don't want to stump anyone, but
First of all, I don't think we know if the war is over, right? The ceasefire is real, meaningful. I don't think we're going to see an eruption of hostilities in Gaza like we have seen, and that's all to be the good. But whether a real next phase 2 of the 20-point plan and the reconstruction and can get underway, still very, very unclear. And there's still the risk of additional rounds of fighting with Hezbollah, which is trying to rearm and not being disarmed in Lebanon and in Iran, where the nuclear materials are not secured and there's no inspection. So we may not be completely out of the woods here. And Israel will have to be vigilant. And the United States will have to be prepared to help Israel with those types of threats while still trying to get this 20-point plan and the broader regional integration opportunity on the road. If it gets on the road, I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits to that, this sort of reverses the question, but it's really the same point, that to help us change the discourse around Israel in the United States and among younger people who have been exercised and agitated by the war is seeing that there's a direction towards something more positive for Gazans, for Palestinians and Israelis together, and for the region more broadly in a way that's positive for U.S. interest. Is that going to solve all anti-Semitism? It is not. Is that going to lead everybody who has concluded in the course of this war that Israel has crossed some line of illegitimacy? I'm sorry to say it won't. But I do think it will draw back into the conversation, into the bigger tent, people who say, I'm critical of policy, I'm critical of leaders, I'm critical of decisions, but I'm not couching that criticism in terms of an anti-Zionism that essentially renders Israel as an illegitimate construct, and the way that affects our community when we who see that Israel's Zionism as a fundamental foundation of our identity feel so threatened by that. So, Israel can help. Let's put it that way. Israel can help us help them.
Yeah.
It helps not to have racist and extremist members of the cabinet. Right?
Does it?
It does. It helps not to look the other way or worse regarding extremist violence by Israelis in the West Bank toward Palestinians, and that takes nothing away from the fact that there are real threats also in the West Bank from Palestinian terrorists. That is a true thing, and the cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority is the best way. It's not a perfect way, but it's the best way to get at that, and that's all undermined by that extreme. So there are those types of things Israel can do that help us. But mostly and fundamentally, it is really buying into what's in this plan, which means better life for Gazans as Hamas is disarmed and brutally removed from power, opportunity to cooperate with a whole range of other countries that are going to try to make and build a better Gaza, work toward that regional integration, and then use those relationships to also have that difficult conversation about what a credible pathway to a Palestinian state looks like. I got into this line of work 30-some years ago, mostly to try to help bring about Israeli-Palestinian peace. And right after I moved to Washington, the Oslo Accords were signed. And I thought, well, I missed my chance. They did it, and it's over.
It's over.
Well, all right. So it was still a full employment career. But of course, I also know how long before October 7th, most Israelis and Palestinians had viewed this as a project that it won't succeed, each blaming the other side. And then after October 7th, I certainly know how hardly any Israeli, even those who have long been supportive of the notion of some sort of two-state outcome, this doesn't feel possible, doesn't feel safe, they're not ready to have that conversation. And yet, here we are. The President of the United States, arguably the most popular president ever in Israel, has put on the table that we need to have a conversation about a credible pathway to a Palestinian state as part of that whole broader regional dynamic where Saudis and Emiratis and Moroccans and others are sitting at that table with their friends Israel and their friends the Palestinians. That's a very different kind of conversation. The outcome, if it can be achieved, might look very different from what was imagined in the Oslo period, and it might take longer, and the security requirements might be very convoluted. But nevertheless, that's on the table, and Israel's willingness to buy into that conversation, even without knowing what it ultimately leads to, I think will help us also improve the atmosphere in which this conversation is conducted to the point where the true anti-Semites, the incorrigible anti-Semites, will be fairly isolated on the margins on both sides.
So I agree with Dan. I think that a real peace process will definitely help, and I think that Israel can do much more in that regard. I also specifically agree as to the remark as to what's happening in the West Bank and violence there, unfortunately, by Israelis against Palestinians and Palestinian communities. I'm extremely worried about that violence. I'm to some extent ashamed at the Israeli authorities' response to that. I'm not surprised because Israel has its minister responsible for the police is a convicted felon that is a Kahana disciple. And I guess that this is what you get in terms of the authorities' response if you nominate a man like that to be your police minister. It's just the case. And the reason I say worried is because when you leave this kind of extremist violence unchecked, it's not only those people who are getting hurt right now, it tends to escalate. And the entire Middle East, and specifically Israel, and specifically the West Bank and Jerusalem, are tinderbox. And if just in terms of the security interest of the state of Israel, speaking as an Israeli patriot, I think you need to take care of that. I think there are other reasons more intrinsic as to justice and the rule of law, but even speaking from a completely security-centered world, sort of airing or echoing my security sources in the Israeli defense apparatus. They're extremely worried about that. And I'm underlining this point because I think it's important. However, I want to say something about the notion of Palestinian statehood. And no one can will peace into being if the Palestinian society itself is not committed to the idea of letting go of violence and notions of right of return to the sovereign state of Israel and violence. You know, I'm a Zionist, and I look at these national movements. So you can assume that even if I do think that Palestinians have a right to national self-determination, and I do, and I write about this, and I wrote about this after October 7 as a journalist. It's not an easy thing to do in Hebrew after October 7. And having said that, I look at our national movement for self-determination, Zionism, and what we underlined. And what we underline is what, or our ancestors underlined, is what we built. So we brought delegations over to show them, you know, here's a village, and here's a town, and here's a road. And we build that, and we can build an entire country. And I think about what the Palestinian movement for national self-determination is underlining. And it's mainly underlining, to me as an observer, victimhood, but also violent struggle and the legitimacy of violent struggle. Now, you know, national movements of this sort also underline victimhood. Okay, and you being a victim could be a powerful tool too. But I don't see this essence of building as something that is essential there. And I'm very discouraged by the ideological animosity and the personal animosity between Fatah and Hamas within the Palestinian society. And I don't think this is going anywhere in terms of somehow this is going to be miraculously solved by the Qataris or the Emiratis or the Saudis. And they're definitely not going to pick up the Hamas weapons. No one is going to fight fundamentalist terrorists dead set on blowing up the peace process if there's going to be a peace process that isn't Israel. No one is going to blow up those tunnels seriously if it's not going to be Israel. No one has a vested interest in that. Everybody will have an interest in saying, it's just fine, it's just okay. And easy as it may be, we should remember October 7 itself. This era of bluffs, of comfortable lies, the sort of, you know, we're going to have a status quo, we're going to sign an agreement, they're going to devote themselves, and they're going to rebuild, but it's an underground. We see the polls conducted within the Palestinian society. We see the admiration, if not with the majority of Palestinians, with dozens of percentiles of Palestinians, to October 7, after Gaza was ruined. So I want to be very realistic as to that. And I want to say that if we need to face the delegitimization of Israel and anti-Semitism, the two are intertwined but are not exactly the same. We need to assume that things are not going to change for the better. I join Dan's hopes as to that. And we need to fight this anyway. And Israel's position there, Israel needs to be the convening force as to fighting the efforts to delegitimize Israel. The fact that the Israeli government didn't sort of sit down in a meeting and say, we're going to devote a large chunk of resources, I mean a lot of money, really. And we're going to ask maybe people in the diaspora to match that if they want to, but it's on us to fight an international campaign, which is both intellectual, social networks, it's everywhere, to delegitimize Israel and to legitimize every violence, not against only every Israeli, but everyone who identifies with Israel or ever hosted an IDF soldier in reserves in his house. And basically saying, you know, everyone there can be killed or should be imprisoned. Israel should be that convening force. And at the same time, diasporas, the Jewish community, together with Israel, that is supposed to be a protector of the Jewish people, need to have this kind of a unified plan, not like 10,000 organizations doing 100,000 things, raising money with 1 million people. This math is not a good math. Trying to have some sort of a consolidated plan to fight the scourge of anti-Semitism that is really very much rising, and you see this much more legitimate everywhere in the world, and unfortunately also around here. So we need to have that done. This is not about talking about this. It's not about more discussions, trying to analyze where we are. It's always good to get some more data, but you really need these plans. Mm-hmm. And it's a very serious thing, and it's not about credit. It's not about that organization doing that. You need to do this as soon as possible because this is a real threat.
Yes, thank you. Let's get, we have 10 more minutes for questions. Okay. Thank you so much. Here's a question about Qatar, and I believe about the deal from just a couple weeks ago. Qatar came out, sorry. No. It says Qatar came at the biggest and possibly only winner of the war in Gaza. Given their significant leverage through funding, both on both U.S. and Israel, what role do they have in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and how should Israel navigate it? That's a big one.
So I don't think that Qatar came out as the biggest winner of the war. I think that the Qataris are definitely out there. They managed to fend off the idea that, the true idea, the fact that they're playing both fields. One field is we have the biggest U.S. Army base in the region, we're an ally of the United States, and in the meantime, we're also supportive of everything that is Muslim Brotherhood, and we're inciting for violence through our state-commissioned TV station, Al Jazeera, and they managed to do that. They managed to do that, and as an Israeli, of course, my government, unfortunately, was to some extent, in understandings at least, with the Qataris, for instance, transferring money from Qatar to the Hamas regime in Gaza. So it's true that the worst is behind them. However, Qatar is very sensitive to criticism in the United States. And the fact that we are even speaking about that, even in a Zionist Jewish conference, this should not be taken for granted. And what happened to the university in Texas and the way that their campus is closed down in Doha, the Qataris continuously speak about that. So keeping the pressure on Qatar is very important. Qatar is going to be there. It's going to be extremely rich, and it's going to try to influence the international conversation and the conversation in this country. The way to go about this is to keep the pressure and to hold them responsible for what they're doing in the region. I think they're responsible for many, many deaths in the region, and to some extent to the extension of the war that they allegedly tried to end through their media and communication empire. And I think they should be, kept in check and held responsible. And this would be done through campaigns and through airing their influence and talking about this, specifically in Washington. I'm not sure that Qatar has a lot of grassroots campaigning going around in this country. I never went to a Z3 conference of people who are really supportive of Qatar and want to bring over the Qatari values to the United States. And that means also that they're fragile because it's money. That's it. Money, money, money. That's it. And that means that they are fragile. People are not calling their congressmen saying, you're not supportive enough of Qatar. That's not happening in this country. So as an Israeli, I would want this brought to the spotlight as much as possible.
I'll just add one thing, which is that when after Israel did the strike against the Hamas leaders in Qatar, President Trump used that as an inflection point to do two things. First, he put pressure on Netanyahu to agree to end the war in terms that he had previously rejected, that is to say, to not end the war when Hamas had not been removed from power and continue to hold its arms. But he also then was able to use that moment of leverage with Qatar and Turkey and some other Gulf states who were very worried about the war spreading, said, you need to do what you have been unwilling to do and force Hamas to accept terms that it had rejected, which is to release all the hostages without Israel's full withdrawal or even a guarantee of the end of the war. And so that was very, very important. That was the key and real credit to the president and his team for understanding that that was a moment of generating pressure on both sides to take those decisions. Now we're at this critical problem of disarmament of Hamas. Nadav is right. Nobody else is going to go in and fight Hamas to take away their arms and withdraw and destroy those tunnels. That can only be done using the same tool of leverage that the president successfully used to get them to release the hostages, which is that Qatar and Turkey actually in some ways more important than Qatar because of the ideological identification that Erdogan as a Muslim Brotherhood figure has with Hamas, to say to them, your time ruling that place is done. You have to give up your arms and you have to leave. A significant number of them have to actually depart for other places, as the PLO did from Beirut in 1982. There's a model for this. Qatar and Turkey have proven that when properly incentivized, both through pressure and maybe through some of the transactional deals that Trump is really good at, and you can ask, about the value of those. Security guarantee here, an F-35 program here. There are lots of things he puts on the table. He's in the souk already with them. So he's got to use that same tool of leverage because I don't see any other tool that will get Hamas actually out of power in the remaining 47% of Gaza, actually relinquishing their weapons, and then being a clean enough environment where somebody, a contractor or somebody, could come in, decommission those tunnels, and actually let the reconstruction begin for Palestinians who are prepared to live peacefully alongside Israel.
I want to end on a note for the audience to actually take something literal away, and this is a great time to shamelessly plug anything you want. People here in this room have a real appetite for foreign policy, for continuing to educate themselves about the Israel-U.S. relationship. Where can they turn to? What should they be reading, listening to? What books, plug something that they might be interested in that they haven't already thought of.
Well, I think we already have a room full of Call Me Back listeners, so I'll just, and I'm one of them.
That may be true, Dan, but the question that Dan Senior asked me to ask everyone in the room is, are you insiders? Are you? Okay, that's really important.
I'll plug one other thing since you get more applause for it. I'm with the Atlantic Council. It's a very prominent and very bipartisan think tank in Washington that has done some really groundbreaking work to support the broadening of Middle East regional integration. On Tuesday morning, we will host the foreign minister of Syria, accompanying the president of Syria, the first time a president of Syria has ever come to Washington, and perhaps ever. And we are already in dialogue with the Syrian government about ways we can support the negotiations between Israel and Syria for a non-aggression pact and fold Syria slowly but surely into that broader regional integration and Abraham Accords project. So if you go to the Atlantic Council website, you will see many, many products and many, many conferences and many, many events that are worth following.
Yeah, I right now I'm on Call Me Back. There's you can read my stuff on Ynet. It gets translated on Ynet in English sometimes. I don't vouch for the translation, by the way. We're working on other projects, including a more in-depth newsletter. And mainly, I want to thank you for being involved. That's very important. I didn't say that at the beginning. Israel was very alone after October 7. I think that the fact that people put a lot of their time, a lot of their emotional bandwidth, and sometimes a lot of their resources in order to support Israel. And now we're seeing the last of the hostages. Unfortunately, the people who have died, sometimes defending Israel, returning back home. That's extremely meaningful, and you should see yourselves as part of this story because you are. So thank you very much for that.
And I'll end on a plug to subscribe to our jweekly.com newsletters or print subscriptions as well. They're fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. This was an incredible panel.